Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, 5 Considerations for ICS Incident Response, in partnership with Dragos. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Kai Thomsen, Certified SANS Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Kai.
Thank you, Carol. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, those of you in the US. Good evening, those of you in Europe, as I am. So you guys and this webcast are the one thing between me living in Bavaria and my beer. So for now, it's water. Prost, as we say here. And this is actually the first time I've given quite a few SANS webcasts. This is the first time both jobs work in one webcast. So yes, I'm the director for Global Incident Response Services at Dragos, and also I teach for SANS, of course, in the ICS curriculum. One piece of trivia, which is in 2020, I think more important than anything else. So I overcome home office blues, like both jobs, working from home instead of traveling the world, riding my new toy, the One Wheel. I twisted my knee pretty badly in August when I rode it first, but it is ridiculously addictive. So looking forward to what you guys tell me of what you're doing. Reach out on Twitter or somewhere, what you're doing to overcome non-travel in 2020. With that, let's get started. So what is today's webcast about? We'll look into how you should be preparing for an ICS incident response event, how to actually assign decision-making responsibility. So who calls the shot when it comes to ICS decisions. Also, we'll look at what should we do to determine when a shutdown of operations is justified. So when do we really have to up the ante when it comes to OT operations? We'll look at root cause analysis. So how did the adversary get in? And finally, talk about engaging an incident response team and what some important points are there. If you have any questions, you know the drill. Post them to the channel and we'll get to them in the last 10 to 15 minutes of this. So let's get started here. Preparing for an ICS incident response event. Luckily, incidents that touch or compromise ICS environments with high impact are very low frequency. So they happen not every week, but if they happen, they do have high impact. The one thing that is really important to differentiate between IT incidents and incident response and OT or ICS is that usually in the world of ICS, of course, an incident comes with physical impact. And it doesn't really matter whether that is targeted. So the intent of the adversary and the intention behind the incident is to have physical impact on the environment, on the plant or industrial process, but also untargeted events like large ransomware cases, especially with ransomware that has some awareness about ICS environments, like the snake, or as Dragos call it, ECANS ransomware is one example, can have some pretty severe impact on ICS environments. So usually that means at a minimum operations stop, but unfortunately sometimes this means there's severe damage that will take quite some time to fix. You all are probably more aware than I am of what fixing an important piece of your process might mean. Sometimes even getting spare parts goes into months, if not a year, of getting replacement parts, depending on what breaks. And regardless of whether your industrial control system is deemed critical infrastructure or not, at the end of the day, it is critical to your business. It is the money machine. So whatever happens will have significant financial impact at some point to your organization. So what is the mission? Generally speaking, whenever it comes to incident response, the mission is the business. as I put it here in the bullet point, IT is a business enabler. Sometimes we tend to forget that in IT. Sometimes we do think that IT might be a means by itself, but it of course is not. It's to enable other people in our organization to do some business. So that means, of course, those of us doing cybersecurity are there to mitigate a certain type of business risk, and that is it. Therefore, the mission of ICS incident response is, of course, to counter cyber threats against the ICS environment, so mitigate this very specific type of risk or negate it if we're really good at what we're doing. The most important tasks of what we're doing for ICS incident response are scoping nature and extent of the compromise, so figuring out what happened and how widespread is it in the environment, providing decision makers with the recommended next step, what should we be doing? So in layman's terms, how big is it? How bad is it? And what should we be doing now? And then conducting root cause analysis to figure out how did they get in? So how did the adversary get to compromise the environment at the extent that they managed to do it? And what can we do against this in the future? So that the famous lessons learned that so many of us probably still have some ways to catch up to really implement them. As we all know, those of us that have done incident response, the lessons learned are usually the hardest lessons to actually learn in our environments, funny enough. So what is important about being able to scope the environment? Of course, it is important to know what is most valuable to you in the environment. So focus on the crown jewels. In fact, this is a lot easier in ICS environments than in IT environments. Those of you that have tried to do this in IT environments are probably aware of the fact that if you start asking departments in any larger organization, what are the most important assets or how do you actually contribute to the business, you get 10 different answers if you ask like 5 people. Anything that has to do with manufacturing or production from an industrial point of view, this is usually a lot easier to answer because it usually boils down to what would you consider a really bad day to happen to the industrial environment? Now you know what the most important systems are, because usually the answer you get is, yeah, if that piece of equipment, that turbine back there fails, we have to evacuate, and once the firefighters are done with dealing with the mess, we can get back in and assess the damage, but it'll be at least 3 months of downtime. So these are usually the answers you get from experienced engineers in any type of more or less volatile industrial environment. So AKA the crown jewels. So what you should usually be doing when you prepare for incident response is figure out what are the most important systems from a technology perspective. So what are really hard to replace or volatile systems, but also from a business perspective. What is the most important process in your industrial environment? So your plant process or manufacturing process. And then moving up in this upside down pyramid. So what are the most critical components, functions or sub-functions, critical systems, and then who owns these? So who's responsible for these systems, but also tracing a path through your network to the perimeter of the industrial network. So following the most likely path of attack an adversary would actually take to reach those systems. Now you know what systems to monitor, what systems to defend most effectively. So in other words, what to focus on. So focus on what's important. That doesn't mean disregard everything else, but you should start somewhere. So focus on what's most important, start monitoring these systems, get to know them really well, and also know whom to talk to when something goes wrong. So again, this is a lot of interdependencies and teamwork at play here, and we'll get to that in a bit. The next thing, though, you have to do, of course, when you're preparing for incident response is know your adversary. So not only know yourself, but of course also know who might be after you. So this is an overview of all the activity groups / adversaries that we are currently tracking at Dragos, exclusively almost targeting ICS environments. Do you have to be aware of all of these? Not really. You should focus on the ones that are important for your industry vertical. So again, also there, focus on what's most important to you and your organization. So victimology, if you look at those cards here, is what will inform you of whether you should look out for these adversaries, learn about them and techniques they're employing, depending on, again, what industry vertical are we focusing on. So let's play this through in a little example. So what I'm focusing on here is the electric sector in the United States. This will give me these 6 activity groups that I need to be aware of and I need to be able to track. So let's focus on one here, just for the sake of the example. So we look at Carbolite right here. So a little bit more detail about those folks. Their mode of operation is IT compromise with some pretty sophisticated malware that has anti-analysis capabilities. They use some encoded binaries that are inside Office documents and some evasion techniques. The advanced capabilities of the malware will also make for good detection, because this is fancy malware, so we might be able to create some rules that will enable us to track that malware better. It's targeting electric utilities in the United States. It has some links to groups tracked by other companies. These are the names, Lazarus and Hidden Cobra. So it rings the bell with North Korea, right? So operating in the interests of North Korean state. So let's look at some techniques. So this is the Mitral ICS attack matrix. Some of you might be familiar with this. So in the horizontal axis here, you see the cyber kill chain. So probably many of you are already familiar with the kill chains. So this is nothing new. And similar to the Mitral enterprise attack matrix, the techniques used against ICS systems are mapped out here in a vertical. And the ones most likely employed by Carbolite, I just highlighted in yellow. So I just marked them. So does this mean you have to be able to detect every single of these marked techniques? Not really. The more, the better, of course, but the adversary has to follow all the steps of the kill chain to accomplish their mission. The more of these phases you have detections in, the better. But if you can detect them somewhere with good confidence, that is all you need. So you need to get started somewhere. This is how you build out your detections. And again, focus on what's important to you and the adversaries that are most likely to target you. Don't try to check all these boxes here. So quick run into how you might be able to do this. So let's add some more buzzwords in this here. Understand your detection capabilities. So this is what we at Dragos refer to as a collection management framework, which is a fancy term for figure out what of the systems we started looking at, the crown jewels, again, those most important systems in your environment, what type of data can you get off them? So what are they logging? So this is an example for an electric utility. So we have a control center, we have a transmission substation, and we have some systems in both of these sites. So we have HMIs, which are Windows-based systems. So they create Windows event logs, and they have registry keys. The one in the control center reports to a CM, and the CM retains the logs for 60 days. You see where this is going, right? We have a data historian that is probably also Windows-based. It creates alarms and actions, and it has data on set points and tags, so ICS specific data. It does local data storage, so not connected to a CM or any other upstream log aggregation system, but at least it retains the data for 120 days, and on and on and on. So this is basically a recording of the status quo of what data is available of your environment, and again, of the most important systems. So by creating this, you learn what detection capabilities you can actually start creating of the data that you should be able to get access to, because it's getting collected in your environment. And then you map this. So green, yeah, we have that covered. Yellow, we should cover this because the adversary might be using this technique, but we're not fully there yet. Red, we have no detection capability for this technique yet, and it might be used by the adversary. Blue, not important. So this is how you can create a heat map and also use that as a KPI of informing your leadership of where you are with developing detection capabilities. And of course, you will not only use these prior to incident response in detecting if something is happening in your environment, but also, of course, once you're responding to the incident. It's really important to be able to detect the adversary in the various phases they're going through by trying to reach their objectives. Some considerations. Number one, even more so than in IT environments, in ICS, it's all about collaboration. It is extremely likely, like more than 90% likely, that your incident responders will not be overly familiar with all the specific details of your OT environment. So you need to have that close collaboration with the OT team, with the operations team that is actually responsible for managing the affected environment. Also, you will need to be able to collaborate with other teams within your organization. And we look at that in a little bit. But think legal, first responders, marketing, IT, OT, any other team that might be able to contribute to minimizing the impact of the event that is going on. That is the important part. But also enabling all the teams that they can most effectively contribute to managing the crisis is important. Second, safety first. Again, physical impact is the most important differentiator between IT only events and ICS security events. It is of the utmost importance that we as incident responders are not responsible for creating something with impact in the ICS environments. Even be able to get on site to step onto the planned environment, we need to be equipped in a way that we can do that and also have the necessary safety certification. So the ultimate example is usually you have to fly out to an oil rig because something happened on an oil rig. Without a helicopter safety license, you're not flying out there. Without the proper personal protection equipment, you're not going out there. But going to any type of industrial site usually requires some mandatory safety training, at least listening to a webcast or whatever it is, watching a video, and usually wearing a hard hat, safety shoes, and at least a reflective vest. So make sure you know what you need to be allowed to go on site. And that also usually means you will always be accompanied by OT personnel that are very familiar with the environment, and you won't be touching systems directly. OT people will, under your guidance, to actually accomplish what you have to do during incident response. But for the incident response team, it's usually hands-off because these are not your systems and you don't understand them fully, so don't break anything. Adjust. Of course, in ICS incident response, we're using many techniques, procedures, and technologies that our peers from the IT side are also using. But be aware that these techniques and procedures, and sometimes even the tools, can always be adapted like one-to-one to the environments that we're dealing with. A good tool example is, for example, EDRs, endpoint detection and response tools. If you've ever tried to run an EDR or any halfway automated forensic analysis tool like Mandiant Redline or Cyber Triage against an ICS system, you will probably have seen that the IT tool goes all into panic mode, throwing up a lot of alerts because ICS software looks really, really crazy to a security system. And that has just to do with the nature of ICS software, which is mostly created for following a specific purpose in an industrial environment. And this is just such a niche to IT tools that they're not aware of what these tools are doing. So you will have to, if possible, whitelist certain things that your ICS tools are doing. So you need to baseline the environment, but also that means if you introduce any type of security tool into an ICS environment that has the ability to block and that is effective, this will probably affect the ICS environment. So don't do that. It's the short lesson for this. Acknowledge also that access to important systems might be very limited time-wise, and prepare and train for these limitations. So one good example that I always used to run into in the environments I was dealing with in my previous previous career, so automotive and steel industry, was that usually in manufacturing, you can get access to systems even if they're operational, so not necessarily a full downtime, when people are out for lunch. That usually means you have 30 minutes to acquire forensic data off a system. So you better time your data acquisition on test equipment or in a lab environment that you know how much data you can acquire within 30 minutes. So that usually means getting a memory dump and maybe a couple of forensic artifacts like Windows event logs and registry hives, and that's it. The limiting factor will usually be the speed of the USB thumb drive or the USB interface actually that you're using to pull this data off, because of course this is always mostly local data acquisition, because again, you're not allowed to install any software on ICS systems, which means no remote acquisition, which means you have to locally go to the system, pull the data off, and then leave again. So this is also where you will be teaming up with OT personnel. So effectively, not the incident responders will be doing most of the acquisition in such an environment. They will train OT personnel on how to do that and then guide them through the process until OT personnel feel safe to do that on their own. And then incident responders will do the actual analysis. But this is usually how this goes. So be aware of the limitations that are important to your environment. Tailor your procedures according to those limitations so you can actually achieve your objective. Let's look at decision-making responsibility. And again, this is really, really important because, again, of the business critical nature and the complexity of ICS environments. Safety and reliability must always be placed above everything else. So shutting down a system because you need to run forensics acquisition is a definite no if shutting down that system would implicate a danger to safety and reliability of operations of the environment. So if that system is a safety instrumented system that is responsible for maintaining safe operations of a environment, of a planned process, there is no way you will get the clearance to take down the systems for acquisition. Sometimes not even if the plant is shut down, because this is a safety system in some industrial environments. Even if the plant is shut down, it still means that processes are ongoing, because, for example, chemical processes just can't be stopped with the push of a button. They take some time to shut down. Same in the steel industry. Shutting down a blast furnace is not like turning off the ignition in a car. It's a procedure that takes days. So just expect, again, that there will be small time windows to be able to access systems, and more often than not, somebody will have to tell you that, yeah, we understand that you really need to access this system for your investigation, but there's no way we can give you that access under safe conditions for the next 3 or 4 days. That is just something we need to accept. But this also means that if we have to up the ante when it comes to taking decisions and for safety reasons about our environment, whoever makes those decisions has to have the authority to pull them through. So what I've seen in quite a number of ICS incidents that I was involved in was this insecurity, this organizational insecurity in making decisions that then were questioned by every level of the hierarchy, that drew out incident response and limiting the impact of an event significantly. So make sure that you know how this works in your organization and you tailor the procedures that have to be followed in incident response according to the organization, and everybody is aware of what's going on and what the procedures are. So it's not only important, of course, to write them down in an incident response plan, but it's also very important that everybody knows this plan and everybody has exercised it so they know how to follow it. And yeah, collaboration, chain of command, and very clear assignment of authority are really, really important here. And yes, I've seen this go wrong more often than I've seen this working in exactly the right way, because it wasn't trained enough and people weren't aware of these incident response plans and what rules were to be followed in a critical situation. Which brings us to the incident command system. So some of you are probably familiar with this. So a standardized way of dealing with crises in organizations, which is highly recommended to also follow when it comes to ICS incident response. So what we can see is that actually within the incident command system, the incident response team is all the way down here. So there's all of this going on in the incident, because again, we're dealing with an event that might cause physical impact to an industrial environment. So we're dealing with an event that, if this impact comes to bear, will mean there is a disaster, an industrial accident potentially. So environmental impact, danger maybe even to people. So we might have to evacuate. We have to bring in the firefighters and other first responders. There will be huge financial impact to the environment. Because we are dealing with a large-scale impact, there is logistics involved for strike teams as well as for maintaining operations as much as we can, also for shutting down operations. There is a lot of planning involved in this. And then there are the operations teams that will do whatever needs to be done to maintain the situation as best as we can. And all of these, of course, have to answer to the incident commander. So yes, I highly recommend you have a plan like this. What we usually see many organizations failing, frankly, is many sophisticated industrial organizations have crisis event planning like this. They follow the incident command system for any type of industrial accident that they can imagine. The gap in thinking happens usually when it comes to cybersecurity events that have physical impact, so attacks against the ICS. And the problem happens from both sides of the aisle. On the one hand, the people that are usually dealing with industrial accidents are used to this. So they're very good at the incident command systems. They're very good at how to conduct first response if an industrial accident happens. But making that leap to, yeah, there might be a computer-based event that leads to a physical impact is something new. So they might not make that leap in their analysis, in their thinking. So just because it is a cyber, in air quotes, event, they don't make the connection that, yeah, what we should be doing now is just following our standard crisis response procedures. And the same, of course, is true for IT teams as well, because most IT organizations are not familiar with this. And they're not having to deal with events that have an impact on such a scale, where there's physical impact on a large scale. So this is really where exercises need to bring all the people together and synchronize the thinking in an organization. So I've seen this actually needing 2 to 3 tabletop exercises on a very high level, so including top executive leadership of an organization. So usually the incident commander, especially in manufacturing, is the plant director. So if these people are involved and running through an exercise, then after having done this 2-3 times, this all comes together, including understanding incident response, and that cyber events might lead to this kind of impact. But again, it's really important to train this. I also recommend Megan Samford's talk from this year's S4 conference, where she talked at length about how to actually do something like the incident command system for ICS incident response. So more decision-making considerations. The incident commander should be selected from your organization's top leadership. So in other words, being well respected and well known within the organization and having a lot of merit with especially the OT team, but also the other leadership in the organization. So this will help a lot. And of course, if these type of executives have prior experience in managing crises, so much the better. So when I started this at my last job, the organization didn't have that much experience with crises. So they need to be trained beforehand, because of course at that level of executive leadership, not winning, again in air quotes, a tabletop exercise doesn't really look good. So don't make them look bad in a tabletop exercise, so prepare them beforehand. But yeah, once usually they get into these types of exercises, they really like it and they see the effectiveness. So if an organization has already matured somewhat to having a good crisis management framework, then usually there will be a selection method for what leaders from within the organization should go into what role of an incident command system. And if not, this is something that has to be considered very early on in this process. The one thing leadership has to decide on, though, and this is really needs to be a leadership decision, is mean time to recovery. So again, if you already have a business continuity organization, this is their main job, figuring out what is the mean time to recovery for the most important business processes and how do we actually achieve that and what is necessary to do that. So this requirement will drive most cybersecurity aspects, and especially, of course, ICS incident response aspects, including team size. If you can get by with an outsourced team, so you just call some incident response provider, or if you have to have an internal team, and whether that team has to be a standing team or is kind of the type of like the voluntary firefighters that usually have another day job but get called in if there's an incident and then have to work in that role. But meantime, the recovery will define all of that, and then how you size the incident response team and how do you actually put it together follows from these requirements. Rules of engagement are also really important. So once you know what the incident response team should consist of and whether it's internal or external, of course, you need to create their rule books. So informing them what the do's and don'ts are during an incident. Also, who to report to, who has to report to them. All of these things are really important. And of course, usually in every incident, there will be some adaptation of the rules of engagements, just following whatever incident is currently going on. But having these standardized in some form, again, is really important so people can train for it and prepare for it. And everybody involved knows what to expect. And then you can still make adjustments during the incident. But if you have to start this from scratch, in the heat of the moment, this will usually go wrong. So let's look at shutdown operations, which we should, of course, try to avoid most of the time. Because again, we might be dealing with high impact events. We have to figure out how high the likely impact might be. On the other hand, again, regardless of whether you're dealing with critical infrastructure or not, the infrastructure, the ICS environment is critical to your business. It's your money machine. It's how your business usually earns money. So shutting it down, especially if you have to do that semi-controlled very quickly, will result in financial losses and also potentially always in some type of damage. So some repairs always have to be made if there's a major shutdown. So you want to avoid that, of course, as much as you can. So let's look at what some guidance might be on taking this decision. Cyber kill chain. The one important thing to note is that when we're dealing with ICS incidents, we're actually dealing with two stages of the cyber kill chain. Stage one usually happens in the enterprise IT environment. So this is where the adversary tries to gain entry, gain access to your environment to begin with, because usually your ICS environment is connected to your enterprise environment in some manner. So this is where the adversary has first to gain access, so they can gather credentials that allow them to move through this environment, but also potentially to pivot into the ICS environment. But also they have to learn about the ICS environment, because every ICS environment is different and unique. Where do they learn about this? From all the data you have about this environment stored on servers in the enterprise environment. So you have topology maps, you have specifications, you have bombs, you have project files that configure control systems on the ICS. All of this usually stored in the enterprise environment. So this is what the adversary is after. Once they've gathered enough information about their target environment, this is when they will try to pivot into the ICS environment itself. So this is what we call the stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain, where they again have to develop, test, deliver, install, modify their capabilities to be able to execute an ICS attack. This, though, doesn't necessarily mean that every ICS attack comes with malware. More often than not, they don't come with malware. They operate the ICS environment itself. So it means trying to gain access to HMI systems in your environment and then just hitting buttons on the HMI to use the capabilities of the ICS environment against itself. That was in a nutshell what's going on here. So simply put, the further along you detect an incident, so the further along the adversary is along this kill chain, the swifter and more consequent and more decisive your answer has to be towards that adversary. So if they're already in your ICS environment, if what you've seen when you start doing the incident response, when you start scoping and analyzing what's going on, if you've seen them already deliver and install their capabilities, so either testing out things on an HMI or having installed malware on key systems, the swifter and more decisive your response needs to be, including potentially shutting down the environment to prevent further damage from happening. So let's look at some escalation factors. So from might not be that important to this is where we need to shut down a plant or a portion of a plant. So there might be, just because of an adversary trying things out in your environment, they might be impacting monitoring or support functions. So loss of visibility might be bad in some environments, but usually you can get by with a certain loss of visibility because operations are still ongoing, and you might be able to quickly recover from that. If you're detecting critical data exfiltration, that might up the ante a little bit. Sometimes in some legislations, so in some countries, you have to swiftly answer that. So all of you in Europe, or all of you having to deal with Europe's general data protection regulations, if you're seeing data exfiltration that touches GDPR relevant data, you now, once you start detecting this, a 72-hour window starts, and A, you have to inform the authorities within those 72 hours, and B, you have to do something about it. So you probably have to shut down network connections to prevent this exfiltration. Similarly, for the National Infrastructure Security, NIS regulation in Europe, which touches critical infrastructure, has to follow some similar regulations. Similar in the United States, North American NERC-CIP regulations requires something along those lines. So this might already not cause a plant shutdown, but some network shutdown. And I mean, the network is there for a certain reason, and these connections are there for a certain reason. So this might mean ultimately that at some point operations will be impacted if you lose certain network connections. So be aware of that and prepare for that. And also be aware of how long you can get by in an environment with shutting down certain aspects that are supporting the process, but not directly impacting the plant process itself. But yeah, the further down you go, so you see some indication of what I'd call a worm, so some capability that might have a large-scale impact. So you might be seeing the next WannaCry or NotPetya advancing that might initiate a shutdown, at least a segmentation of the environment, and then dealing with the side effects to your plant process. Or the adversary is close to entering the ICS environment for whatever reason, has already compromised it, but has an impact to safety. So you might be seeing them on the engineering workstation of a safety instrumented system, or maybe having touched a safety instrumented system to begin with. So again, the more impactful you see an adversary acting in your environment, the more impact your response, the more strong your response needs to be. If that sounds very high level and simplistic to you, well, it is at a certain point, because this needs to be tailored to your environment and it needs to be tailored to your requirements. So the blueprint is all I can give you at this point, but this should be enough for you to have some guidance on what levels of decision an incident commander should come to, depending on what you're detecting during incident response. If that makes sense. I hope so. So thresholds of acceptable or unacceptable risk. Again, the guidelines are important. What needs to be considered though always, again, especially in ICS, but I would fully sign off this for IT as well, of course, if IT operations are really, really important to your business, and where aren't they these days? Always match the consequences of what you're doing during incident response to what the business impact is. So at the end of the day, IT's mission is to enable the business. So we should always balance the impact of what we're doing against the impact of what the adversary is doing in an incident. So if one or the other wins in that scaling, this basically shows us what we need to do. So to give you an example, when I had to deal with WannaCry, I, as the lead responder, of course, recommended to my incident commander in the organization, we should shut down unnecessary parts of the plant and we should start segmenting as much as we can. Yes, I'm fully aware that might have business impact, but this is the security recommendation I'm making. So the incident commander came to the decision that no, we should not fully shut down the plant, and we should limit segmentation so we can still maintain a certain level of plant operation. So balancing the risk there, and at the end of the day, I have to say that they were fully correct in their decision, and my security recommendation would have been potentially even more impactful than the actual event that we were dealing with. So in this case, WannaCry. So this is kind of the decision-making process that should really be more prevalent when it comes to ICS incident response. Root cause analysis. This is some of the thing, the one thing potentially that is most often not done in ICS because of the difficulties that we usually have with obtaining enough data that allows us to actually analyze how the adversary managed to compromise the environment. There's most of the time just not enough data available for full incident analysis, just due to the level of maturity that we're usually dealing with in ICS environments nowadays. Without root cause analysis, though, we are prone to falling victim to exactly the same attack down the road. So what will usually happen with root cause analysis is that if we do this for the first couple of incidents, and hopefully there are smaller incidents, the whole result of the analysis will be, now we didn't have enough data of this environment to figure out how the adversary got in. So the lesson learned is, of course, up the ante for monitoring, develop that capability so the next time something happens, we can gather enough data to figure out how they got into the environment and how they could compromise the environment. So if you look at this from a GRC perspective, once you've seen a small number of incidents, and the lesson learned is always we need more data to fully do root cause analysis, this should be dealt with so we can get better with figuring out how the adversary got in. Don't go over the top with this though. Number one, always prioritize. Focus first on scoping the incident. So always first try to answer the question, how bad is what is going on and how many systems have been compromised? So how far is the threat spread throughout the environment? That is priority number one. If it's possible from the setup of your incident response team, dedicate 1 or 2 analysts to work on root cause analysis, gather the data that is necessary for that, and start analyzing that data. If you just don't have those resources, don't do it. That is bad in a certain way, but again, prioritize focus. Number one is, again, you're a business enabler, you're mitigating certain business risks. So focus on that, focus on maintaining the business first. And second, focus on root cause analysis. But again, preparation helps a lot with this. So similarly to how to prepare for an incident, knowing what it takes to acquire data, meaningful forensic data from the environment, how long it takes, what procedures are necessary, and who can actually perform these. So people that of course should also regularly train this in a hands-on manner, acquiring data from the environment. The better you can interleave this with the scoping and containing of incident response. So yes, you can get better at this over time. You just need to be aware of that this needs to be a distinctive role. So everybody in the incident response team should have an assigned role that they get into once they get engaged in an incident, so everybody naturally does something similar to like what special forces do. So there's always dedicated people that have certain tasks to do, and the same thing should be happening inside your incident response team. So if you have a large enough team, there's always 1 or 2 people that are tasked with root cause analysis, and everybody else does the scoping and incident analysis. So how do you engage an incident response team? Again, stakes are much higher than in IT because usually, again, physical impact, or if critical infrastructure, not only physical impact to the environment, but to many, many customers and second order effects and all of that. So figure out that you have the right model for choosing incident responders. So number one is, of course, can we outsource this or should it be fully an in-house team? So if I had my way, no, I'm not saying outsource everything, quite the contrary. If I had one wish, we could all afford incident responders internally, because then they're fully embedded in the organization, they know the culture, they know who to talk to, they're most effective. But this is usually not the case in organizations. We can't afford that. So at best, we might be able to afford a non-standing team, so internal staff that have other jobs as well, so other tasks assigned to them, and if something happens, step into the role of incident responder. So the minimum that you should have is staff capable of leading incident response teams. So to some extent, they should be able to talk the talk and walk the walk, but I don't expect them to be full forensic analysts at any level, but they should understand what needs to be done and be able to guide an external team. If you consider external partners, though, what you should consider is that usually it makes more sense to outsource incident response capabilities than network security monitoring, because network security monitoring is even more necessary for your environment. It also requires that integration into your company culture and your operations. So if you have to decide on what to outsource, I recommend, quite contrary to what many organizations are doing, in-house network security monitoring, outsourced incident response, and then with at least 1-2 people in your staff, in your team, being able to lead the team, the actual incident response team. Team size, consider that if you need 3 on-site responders, you'll probably need 9 to 10 people actually on staff to meet those requirements, because 1, you have to work in shifts usually when a large incident happens, so you have to work around the clock, and 2, there's always people that are not there, or that just left your company and they're open positions, or they're in training or PTO or whatever. Also, be aware that if you decide to have a non-permanent response team, maintaining proficiency of those incident response skills is much harder than, of course, if this is a standing team that does nothing but incident response and all the other supporting functions for that. So just be aware of that, that if you think you can save money because it's not a standing team, you might have to spend more money on maintaining their training and capabilities. Experience, this is especially important if you're thinking about outsourcing incident response. Make sure that whoever is your provider, their first industrial control environment is not yours. So they have some proven experience with that. And of course, since ICS in scare quotes isn't really a thing, ensure that they are familiar with your industry vertical. So not necessarily your particular plant, but they should have some familiarity at least with your vertical. So whether it's petrochemical or electric utility or manufacturing, they should have that experience. So a good incident response partner has some good incident responders. Of course, a great partner will also help you to mature along that path of getting better overall cybersecurity. So they could offer you other services as well, just to burn down the hours that you buy usually during your retainer. So that is something I recommend to look into. How do we actually make sense of all these hours we bought for incident response? What else can we get from that provider? And then preparation and training, of course, really, really important again, because again, this is multi-team collaboration and much more complex than if it were just on the IT side. So enabling all those different teams in your organization to play well together takes time. From my experience, this is measured in years and not months. There are such large cultural gaps usually in the organization that it just takes a lot of time. It requires planning and exercise and lots of exercising together to actually accomplish this. It can be done, and actually, even for normal operations, having this level of collaboration will make you much more effective as an organization. So highly recommended. If this were the only one thing I could wish for in an organization, it would be training for that multi-team collaboration, because this helps you so much more than for just incident response. With this, I've already talked way too long. So let's end this now, hand it back to Carol. Just real quick, yeah, we created another white paper. This is what we do at Dragos, right? So you can download it right here. This is how you can get hold of me if you have any questions. If you have questions right now, Carol, back to you. Thank you all.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We do have a couple of questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for Kai, please enter it into the questions window now. The first one asks how to pull data if USB are not allowed or blocked.
good question. Depends on the environment. Sometimes there might be a network connection, so you might be able to get network level access to a device. If that is not possible, what you might have to revert to is reboot a system from a analysis CD-ROM. So creating a bootable environment for a system so you can at least gather data off the disk of that system. So it totally depends on what the requirements are yeah. But yeah, everything gets more difficult if there's no USB access. So again, I would recommend first look at if you can get network level access to that system. And second, if that is not available, look if you are allowed to reboot the device from a analysis CD, and as a last resort, shut down the device, pull out the hard drive, and do full disk copy and then analysis.
All right,
Next
thank
question.
you. Do most ICS incidences start on the IT side and then make their way into the OT side?
Yes, absolutely. Most start that way. The downside, though, is with the level of outsourcing and outtasking that we see in ICS environments, the enterprise environment might not be the enterprise environment of your organization. It might be an environment of one of your suppliers. So imagine you have a portion of your ICS that is really important managed by a vendor. So it might be the vendor or integrator that gets compromised that does maintenance of your environment. Or it might be in logistics. So it might be one of your suppliers that got compromised and you get the incident going in that way. So yes, they always happen first on the IT side, but no, it doesn't mean it's necessarily only your IT environment that is compromised. That depends on your specific setup.
All right, thank you. Let's see here. On the kill chain slide, what does C2 stand for?
Command and control. Yeah, sorry for those crazy acronyms. So it's the reaching out to systems on the internet controlled by the adversary.
All right, thanks. You're talking about exfiltration of critical data in relation to GDPR and the likes, but wouldn't the extraction of, for instance, the recipe for a pharmaceutical drug also be critical to your business?
I would certainly say so. So to me, although that would I would consider an IT incident response event, because usually that recipe is stored in your enterprise environment, somewhere on a server, right? So usually it's in like 3 places. It's in a safe somewhere stored safely, probably on paper or a USB drive that might not be allowed in your environment. Kidding there. It might be on a server. And yes, it might be in the programming of the controllers that actually create the mixture for that specific pharmaceutical recipe in the industrial environment. But this is actually the hardest place or most difficult place to pull this data out. So I usually assume the adversary trying to steal this secret recipe from your IT environment. Usually the aim of getting inside an ICS environment is not stealing this type of information. We see this sometimes happening, but most of the time, the aim of the adversary, once they hit the ICS, is to actually have an attack with impact, so bring down your production and not steal the information about the production.
All right, let's try and squeeze more in. Do you know if industries are implementing controls or inspections prior to installment on PLC hardware for SCADA systems? Previously, I found several unnecessary services that gave access to the system, backdoors.
So sometimes this happens. It depends a lot on the level and type of regulation for a certain industry. But also sometimes, yeah, you find backdoors, again, in scare quotes, because these backdoors are maintenance access functions of the vendor that you cannot turn off. So Hardening and detecting these is very good. Sometimes you just have to be aware that you will not be able to shut them down or deactivate them. So the minimum you should be doing then is to at least monitor for unauthorized access of these types of connections or backdoors, if you want to call it like that. But yeah, there's no overall regulation that requires every type of industry to do this type of risk analysis and physical analysis of these systems. It's certainly something that we do at Dragos for some of our customers. This is the proactive team. So my peer team on the other side of the aisle, if you will say so, that does pen testing and architecture assessments. But yeah, again, it depends on specific industry verticals and specific regulations pertaining to these verticals if companies have to do this, or if it is just something that some companies that are further along their journey on having better cybersecurity in ICS are actually doing.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Kai, for your great presentation, and to Dragos for partnering with SANS for this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you all. Have a good day.